What's going on, everybody, and welcome to another Wheel of Time diary, the second one now for The Shadow Rising, book 4 of the series, where I didn't quite get caught up to where I wanted to be, but I did get a little bit more done than I did last week. I am up through chapter 10 now, so up to chapter 11, which is actually a lot less than I thought it was, so I have a lot of catching up to do this weekend. The good news is that at the time that I'm recording this, I was actually not selected for the jury. So even though I did have to go in on the first day of the week on Monday for the selection, I was not selected. So the rest of the week is a little bit more open than I was initially anticipating and planning for it to be, which is, of course, a helpful boon. As for what I read in the spoiler free, I rather enjoyed what I read. Pretty much just as always at this point, I'm looking rather nervously at some of those books a little bit later in the series there to see what happens when I get to those points and see how much I enjoy that stuff. But up to this point, so far, I'm still heavily enjoying myself. There's plenty of events, plenty of things happening, plenty of stuff to talk about. I read for 5.25 hours, so again, still less than my normal for the previous 3 books. My normal was generally between 6.5 and 8.5 hours, so the fact that I did not even reach that tells me nothing good, essentially. But I did read chapters 3 through 10 this week, so I guess I will just kind of talk about what happened in them. There's really not much to say for the spoiler free, just that several big and impactful scenes happen. Well, not several big and impactful scenes happen, but a couple scenes that I feel like are very important for the future of this book specifically occurred. And then several other scenes that were just, kind of fun and enjoyable and cool in their own way also happened that are a little bit more personal on a character level rather than a, macro book level, let alone series level. So I guess I'll just kind of start off with chapter 3, and even reading my notes here on my phone, I actually have no idea what happened in chapter 3, quite frankly. I guess it must have been a Perrin chapter because of some of the reference that I've made here, but I think all that I really remember of it was related to discussions with Aiel and uh, essentially other theories about what happened in Rand's room that we discussed from chapter 2 last week, but also some other rather non-comforting stuff about what Ruark, who is one of the Aiel, said to Perrin at the end, basically that Rand might be the Dragon Reborn, according to all the prophecy of these peoples, but that to the Aiel, he is considered he who comes with the dawn. That there is a chance that he is not he who comes with the dawn, that the two are not necessarily the exact same thing. So the Aiel are here protecting, guarding, and kind of sided with Rand at this point in the story, but that might not always be the case if Rand turns out to not actually be the one who comes with the dawn, even though, we're pretty certain that he is, but I feel like that kind of brings up the idea that he might not be, which is rather interesting to me. Moving into chapter 4 was another, kind of extraneous POV to some extent, just that POVs that didn't really appear throughout much of the rest of the reading was of Tom. I'm glad to see Tom back again. I really like Tom's character. I'll continue to beat this horse because I can. So I really wonder that the beginning of scene, or chapter 4, the beginning of the scene featured Tom basically putting together a form of letter, even though it's really just kind of a note of warning for somebody who we're not exactly sure who it is, or at least I'm not exactly sure who it is. Maybe I missed something. That we basically don't get any super great resolution on in this scene because he is interrupted by Matt. And again, we get some more great Matt and Tom interactions here. They make a great pair. They discuss stuff such as, Matt's desire to leave and other stuff that Matt is feeling about his anxieties. Essentially, there's a couple other points where he discusses his anxieties throughout the reading that I did with people like Egwene as well, and noticing that Moraine is kind of eyeing him and being nervous about that fact. So that's something that's going on with Matt. I'm really curious to know what this scene was with Tom, though. Like I said, with that sort of note that he made, clearly meant for somebody who I don't think we know who it is yet, but it's got to be important for something, at least later in this book, potentially later in the series, depending on how things go, just based off of the fact that, you know, the book spent half a chapter focusing on that, albeit a really short chapter. It was only like 5 pages, but it was, you know, a decent point to make that, if anything, that short chapter length makes it, you know, even more of a curiosity as to why it was specifically included. Next up, we get into chapter 5 with an Egwene POV that continues for a couple chapters. It seems like 3 of them. Yeah, it looks like 3 Egwene. Well, these chapters mix in between the next however many chapters, actually. Is it the next 4 of them? Switch between Egwene and Elaine, I think. So chapter 5 is first these characters interrogating the Black Aja from the very end of The Dragon Reborn. Is that the name of the 3rd book? I believe it is. I'm having a brain fart at the moment. They're interrogating and continuing to interrogate and reflecting on past interrogations with these Black Aja, suspecting that both these questioners yield only part of the tale, that they're not really corroborating anything, but they're not necessarily denying each other's stories either. So there's a little bit of conflict going on with their tales about what might be being planned by the Black Aja, where, was it Leandrin who is the leader of the Black Aja right now, where she's taken some of the others and what they plan to do, what's going on there. Some of the plans that were kind of leaked between these two are actually kind of terrifying if they're true. For example, the latter tale, the one told by Ajoya, is that, if that's how you pronounce her name, it was a particularly interesting one because, like, I was low-key terrified if, like, that was actually the plan. And I'm not entirely sure I fully remember what the plan itself was, but it's not good. I hate the fact that I'm already forgetting it, you know, already. Like I said, some of the minute details that might be important for later. It's just, my mind has been on so much lately, I don't remember stuff. The next chapter in Doorways was seeing a little bit of conflict between the Aes Sedai when Moraine shows up again, and Egwene and Moraine essentially are arguing about what to do with Rand and his being the dragon and his insistence to stay in Tyr, in the Stone of Tyr, despite it perhaps being better to leave after a little while instead of letting, you know, the opposition gather to try to defeat him, which we'll see a little bit later. It's an interesting point, also mildly strange in the midst of some of the... And then also at the end of the chapter, you get a little bit of Elaine talking about her love for Rand, speaking with Egwene specifically, which I thought was an interesting, albeit a little bit of a strange choice in the midst of some other serious occurrences. But I think in this regard, that will be a little bit of a staple throughout a good chunk of the series. And then chapter 7. Next up, we have chapters 7 and 8, which in some sense are kind of the same scene, with Egwene and Elaine deciding to personally visit Rand's chambers to kind of see what's going on with him, and also to kind of mess with him a little bit in one way. Specifically at the very start, there's a lot of cool magic stuff happening here where they're trying to get a gauge on what they can or can't maybe help Rand learn with the power. Given that they're 2 different strains of the power, there's a lot that doesn't really mix and doesn't really work between them going together. But it is an interesting thing, some of the stuff that happened, the fact that Rand just kind of doesn't really know or doesn't really think about what he's doing. Things just kind of happen, which is an entertaining idea, given that a lot of the amateurs, essentially, the learners of the power in the White Tower, go through a very long and lengthy process of learning how to do very basic stuff and getting accustomed to that, whereas Rand is, you know, overflowing with this sort of power that can do dang near anything that he thinks of doing without him realizing that that's what he's doing. Oftentimes he doesn't even know how he does stuff. He doesn't recall how he does stuff after the fact. Whereas, you know, oftentimes if you do something, you're able to kind of learn from that because you're consciously thinking about that and you're consciously recognizing what you're doing and think about after the fact, just like, okay, what can I do with that better? Rand doesn't really have that with his magic, whereas the girls kind of do. So there was a confrontation there that I thought was rather entertaining. And then at the end of the scene, also, Rand and Egwene essentially finally admit to each other that they don't really love each other as potential partners, but rather more like siblings. So they kind of give up that aspect of their love moving into chapter 8, where Elaine basically professes her own love in some sort of roundabout way. So Egwene saying, I don't love you that way, I don't want you that way, Rand, and then Elaine saying, but I do. So that was rather fun. I surprised I don't have more issue with this scene. It's just a little bit goofy, but also was handled surprisingly well in my opinion, especially when the back half of chapter 8 it also has a Rand POV where he's discussing stuff with the High Lords of Tyr, because he's the ruler of Tyr, so he's kind of doing this political stuff on this, not on the side, it's basically his job. So he's doing this political stuff, discussing with the High Lords of Tyr, but then it flashes back and forth between what he's discussing with them, but also his thoughts on Elaine and Egwene and Min and some other stuff. It's just really fun and interesting. But now that I'm actually thinking about it, I didn't note this in my notes, but I've just thought about it now. I think the prologue featured, not the prologue, it was chapter 2 when Rand's POV popped up in the book. And at the beginning of his POV was a dream in which he saw, I believe it was Elaine and Min essentially inviting him into a pool. And that interests me because I think this is kind of foreshadowing the fact that Egwene's kind of no longer in that love pool for him, while the other two kind of are. I'm not entirely sure if that's what that was for, but I just had that thought now, so that's really interesting. And then finally, chapter 9 was a pretty big one. Chapter 10 was a pretty big one as well. These two were just great. The first half of chapter 9 I thought was one of the more messy aspects of the series, just in the fact that it was like a shifting POV. It kind of went between different characters as they're experiencing their different things and different things they're concerned about, such as Perrin searching for ways to have Zareen leave Stone without him, so that he doesn't have to deal with her being there in case danger strikes. Obviously, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, Matt being eyed by Moraine and constantly wondering why Tom is kind of not around, because Tom sort of disappeared, which I think is related to chapter 4, that note that I mentioned earlier. There's Elaine spending time with Rand, so the two of them interacting with each other, and then Egwene and Nynaeve continuing to question the Black Aja until they are inevitably moved, I think, back to the White Tower, but I'm not entirely sure if that's true. But the back half of the chapter is quite insane because Lanfear, who is Selene, or rather Selene, who is Lanfear, that's probably the better way to frame it, shows back up again, finally. I was wondering why in the world she just kind of disappeared from the narrative in some sort of sense, but she's back all of a sudden in Rand's room, trying to seduce him into, doing things the way she wants to, not just to let Rand be trained by some of the male Forsaken who are strong with the power, but also to eventually be able to overthrow those other Forsaken and potentially even the Dark One himself. So she seems to have sort of her own motivation separate from the Dark One in some sense. That was interesting stuff, but their discussions and their discussions, not really the right word for it, their interactions with each other in chapter 9 were fantastic. I absolutely love Rand's obstinance in the chapter. It's just fantastic to see someone standing his ground in this way, even in the face of someone like Lanfear, who is a Forsaken, even though, it's kind of strange that he refuses to kill Lanfear as the Forsaken. Not that he necessarily probably could. He might not be powerful enough yet to be able to do that, but he doesn't even really try to, and part of that is because, she may be a Forsaken, but I still see a woman here, and I don't want to hurt a woman. I think that's stupid reasoning, quite frankly, when you're dealing with a Forsaken, and you're the Dragon Reborn. That seems rather, like an unintelligent move, but I will let it pass because it was still fun, and the scene ends flowing right into chapter 10 with one of the best battle sequences in the series so far, and certainly one of the more exciting ones. It was probably my favorite one outside of the climax of, I think, The Great Hunt. It was, and then was also entertaining and easy to follow in ways that, like, the climax of Eye of the World wasn't really that much. And also takes a little bit more of a dive into Rand's thought process with the magic and with the power and how he's doing stuff than either Eye of the World or the Dragon Reborn did, because kind of both of those instances he was just kind of doing stuff. This time around he's kind of thinking a little bit more about that, and I really appreciated it. But that is where I ended with my reading this week was at the end of chapter 10, at the end of that battle sequence. And I'm presuming that very shortly in the reading to come this week, I'll experience some material with the group essentially leaving Tyr now that, the Stone of Tyr was attacked, and presumably many people were killed in the space of that attack, people trying to get at Rand with tons of Trollocs and tons of fades and everything like that. So that is where I stopped, and I'm looking forward to continuing. I'm hoping to get a much bigger chunk of this book read this weekend than I did last weekend, and especially more than I did a couple weekends ago. So we'll see if I'm able to actually catch up this time around. I will certainly try to. But this little thing right here is kind of getting in the way of that. Not that that should be like the top priority or anything, but I am finishing up The Lesser Devil, and I want to have that done by the end of the month, and I'm not entirely sure how well that's going to go. So we'll see how I balance things out this month. I genuinely have no idea how well I'm going to do, but I will certainly try my best. But thank you guys for watching this video, this rambly mess. If you did, I appreciate it. As always, I'll be back again next week with another one of these and whatever I read in the book over the coming week. And Tuesday, I believe, is a review of the Wandering Inn book / volume 1. I think that's the one that comes out this coming Tuesday. So if you're interested in that, consider checking that out. But I will be back next week with another diary, just like I promised.